Okay, we are live on Facebook and YouTube. We are also seeing some messages come into the chat. So thank you everyone for joining. Please feel free to tell us where you're joining from today. I'm in Baltimore, Maryland. We're going to have David introduce himself in just a moment. If this is your second time joining us, welcome back. We're very excited to have David Mizejewski, naturalist with the National Wildlife Federation, join us again to talk about native plants, gardening for wildlife. Our last topic was about planting in the fall and leave the leaves and all of those great topics. This time we're going to be focusing on native shrubs. And David has pulled together some great slides for us to go over. We do want to see your questions, so feel free to post questions in the chat and we'll try to grab them and answer them live on this call. If you are joining from YouTube, subscribe. This is our new YouTube channel. We're very excited to be growing this platform, so please stick with us and join future live streams. If you're joining us from Facebook, welcome. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to David to get started talking about native shrubs. Thank you for joining, David.
Thanks, Julie, and hi, everybody. First of all, Happy New Year. We're still in January, we can say that. I'm thrilled to be here again with you guys. A lot of us are experiencing, pretty chilly, cold winters right now. And I know we're all sort of fantasizing about getting back outside in the warm weather and getting our fingers in the dirt. So I am fully here with you guys, indulging in the spring garden bug fantasy in the middle of the depths of winter. So hopefully today I'll be able to, inspire you guys a little bit to consider planting more shrubs in your gardens, in your landscapes. That's what we're going to be talking about today. Of course, I am with the National Wildlife Federation, and I have been very active in all of our native plant habitat work and that movement that we started, 50, 60 years ago, almost at this point. And I've been with the Federation for 25 years. And I actually came to run the Garden for Wildlife program. That's what I was originally hired for back in the year 2000. I've written a how-to book on the subject called Attracting Birds, Butterflies, and Other Backyard Wildlife. And I'm still very active with all of our native plant habitat work, including supporting our wonderful native plant business, Garden for Wildlife Incorporated, who is actually a resource for all of you to purchase the native plants that we all know are so important for wildlife. So again, I'm thrilled to be here with you guys tonight. So I have just a handful of slides. The title of my talk, actually, hang on one second, and I'm going to call up my slideshow here. And here we go. So Julie, will you just give me a verbal? You can see that, right?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. I can't see the live stream anymore because I'm looking at my slides. So that's why I needed that verbal recommendation. Yeah, so the title of my talk tonight is 5 Reasons You Need More Shrubs. And if this picture of the female cardinal munching on some American beauty berries isn't enough to inspire you alone, it's also a little bit of a hint at one of the most important reasons why you should be planting more native shrubs in your gardens and landscapes, but we'll get to that. Again, as I mentioned, I'm with the National Wildlife Federation. We're one of the oldest and largest wildlife conservation groups, and we really kind of launched the native plant habitat movement in the US back in the 70s, and we continue to be leaders in that space today. And so I think the best place to start this talk about 5 reasons why you need more shrubs is to define what the heck a shrub is. So a shrub is generally agreed upon to be a woody or semi-woody plant that has multiple stems. And so think of different plant forms. Think of a tree. A tree is essentially a woody plant that has, for the most part, one single trunk. And it's a perennial plant, so it lives for many years, and shrubs are as well. Shrubs are very similar to trees, with the exception that they generally have multiple stems. And there are some plants that maybe kind of straddle both of those categories. There are some plants that can have single stems, or they can have multiple stems. So whether or not it's a shrub or a tree kind of depends on the form that individual plant is growing in. And another point to make here is that that I don't think a lot of people really think about, or that there's a wide understanding of, is that shrub, like tree, is not really like a botanical category for plants. It's really just a form that plants grow in. So in other words, there's not like in taxonomy, how we organize different species that are all related to each other. It's not like there are the trees and they're all a related group of plants, and there are the shrubs and they're all a related group of plants. Wildly different types of plants can grow in the form of a tree or a shrub. So it's really just sort of a way of describing the way a plant looks. So loosely defined, shrubs are perennial woody plants that have multiple stems. And so hopefully that gives a little bit of a better, understanding of what exactly a shrub is. So let's get into the 5 reasons why you want to plant more shrubs in your landscape. The first is that shrubs are native everywhere. Now, there's no one individual shrub species that is going to be native coast to coast or globally or anything like that. But by what I mean by this is that no matter what part of the country you're in, no matter what part of the world you're in, the ecosystem that's native there and the plant communities that are native there include a lot of different species of shrub. And what that means is that you have a lot of options. Depending on where you live, you might not have ferns, for example, or you might not have succulents or cacti in your ecoregion, right? But for sure, no matter where you live, there are some species of shrubs that you can plant in your landscape to get all the benefits from them. And I think that's a compelling thing, because as gardeners, as landscapers, we're always looking for the most interesting, the most diverse, but also the easiest to find plant material to grow, right? And so the fact that shrubs are pretty much ubiquitous, no matter what ecoregion you're in, no matter what climate you're in, there are shrub species found in the desert. There are shrub species that grow in grassland ecosystems. There are shrub species that grow in woodlands, that grow in the mountains, that grow in coastal areas. So I just think it sort of lends to the planting of shrubs, just simply because no matter where you are, you're going to be able to find a species native to that region, or in fact, multiple species native to that region. This is a Carolina shrub rose, which is, I don't know if people really think of rose bushes as shrubs, but they are. And this is one of our beautiful native roses. You can see that gorgeous pink flower. It's a very simple flower compared to the ornamental roses, as you can see, but it's incredibly fragrant and has wonderful wildlife attracting properties to it. So we'll talk a little bit more about that aspect of shrubs. So my number 2 reason why you should add more shrubs to your garden or landscape is that they come in all sizes. So there are shrubs that are ground covers, and I'm thinking of something like a bunchberry. Bunchberries are a kind of dogwood, and we tend to think of dogwoods as small trees or shrubs, but bunchberries are really a ground cover, and a lot of people might mistake them for kind of like a perennial herbaceous plant that does not have a woody stem, but just because of the form. But they are woody, and they grow close to the ground. They only grow maybe 6 inches tall. So that's one end of the spectrum of shrubs. And then you have plants like this oak leaf hydrangea, which these suckers can get to be 10, 12, maybe even 15 feet tall. Funny anecdote, some previous owner of my home. Oh, and by the way, I live in New Jersey. I'm in the northern part of New Jersey, not too far outside of Manhattan. And so somebody who owned my house prior to me planted an oak leaf hydrangea in the front as a foundation planting. And what's unfortunate, because I had not yet had the opportunity to transplant it, is that this thing gets so big, it completely covers the windows in the front of my house. So it's really not a good choice for that spot in the landscape. I do have a spot in my backyard that's sort of part sun, part shade, which is where this native shrub grows naturally. It's a native a little bit further south than where I am, but at any rate, hopefully this spring I will find the time, early spring, to dig it up from the foundation of my house and move it to the backyard, where it's going to be able to really grow to its full size and actually be much more of a landscape specimen. So again, shrubs are very diverse, and or I should say a diversity of plants grow in the shrub form. So whether you have, a suburban property like mine, that's, maybe a quarter of an acre, a little bit less than that, or maybe you're living in a city and you have a much smaller, maybe row house type scenario, or maybe you're out in the country and you have a big rural piece of property. There are going to be plants that grow in the shrub form that are native to where you are, that will fit the scale of whatever garden space that you're working in. There are many shrubs too that will happily grow in containers, in big pots. So maybe you don't even have your own garden space, right? Maybe you're gardening on the rooftop of your building or on your front patio or porch or deck or balcony, and you want to add some kind of woody plants. Well, it's going to be hard to grow a tree in those scenarios, but you can absolutely find a good shrub species that's going to work in a container in the space that you have. So again, there's just a lot of options between, the fact that there are shrubs growing in every single ecosystem, and they come in every size and shape. So again, it just lends them to being good choices for our gardens. All right, so my third reason why you want to add more shrubs to your landscape or your garden is that they really offer year-round interest. So again, think of your herbaceous perennial plants, your wildflowers. They're active during the spring and the summer and then into the fall, but they generally die back in the fall and they're kind of dead and dormant, and oftentimes the upper parts of the plant kind of go away in the winter months. And they oftentimes too, at least from a kind of a conventional point of view, offer sort of beautiful aspects for your landscape really only in like one or maybe two seasons, when they're blooming for the most part. And I sort of couch that a little bit because I personally think the dead stems of perennials are very beautiful, and they do add a lot of architectural interest in the fall and through the winter if you leave them standing, but that's another talk. As far as shrubs go, because they are woody plants, they are going to provide structure in your garden in all of the seasons, all 4 seasons if you have them, all 2 seasons if you have them, winter, spring, summer, fall, cold season, warm season, wet season, dry season. Seasons are different depending on what region of the country you're in. But, no matter what, if you plant shrubs, you're going to have those stems and that structure there. So you don't just have sort of a blank space. And so just from a landscape design point of view, the structure that shrubs provide is actually a real benefit in our landscape designs. Beyond that, just that pure structure, as I mentioned a bunch of times already, shrubs come in all different sizes and shapes, and all different kinds of plants grow in the shrub format. So you can get evergreen shrubs. So they're going to provide even more structure and visual interest, particularly in the winter months in the northern parts of the country where, the deciduous trees all lose their leaves and the herbaceous plants all die back, etc. So you can find evergreen shrubs, whether they are broadleaf evergreens, things like, rhododendrons or native azaleas and things like that, or whether they're needled evergreens. So things like junipers and whatnot, that that are going to provide that evergreen benefit from a visual point of view in your landscape. But because of the fact that shrubs are sort of active year-round, many shrub species have 4 seasons of interest in terms of beauty. So many shrub species will bloom in the spring, and they'll have, ornamental or maybe semi-ornamental. They're not always big, showy flowers. And then those flowers will eventually get pollinated, hopefully. And then in the summer and into the fall, they'll produce berries. So the berries themselves have a lot of visual interest. Berries come in all different colors. There's blueberries and purple berries and red berries and blackberries. And I don't mean blueberries and blackberries like the fruit. I just mean berries in those colors. And those are providing visual interest. There's also some really great wildlife benefit, which we're going to talk about in a second. But, and then as you get into the fall, many shrubs will turn beautiful colors, the deciduous ones, as they begin to go dormant, just like trees. So I'm thinking of berries like the sumacs. Shrubs like sumacs, and there's a bunch of different species, smooth sumac and aromatic sumac, and even staghorn sumac, which is one of those ones that's like maybe a tree, but maybe it's a shrub. It's usually multi-stem, but it gets pretty big. At any rate, the sumacs, the The vacciniums, so the blueberry family and huckleberries, all of those get beautiful scarlet red leaves on them in the fall. So they, again, are very, very ornamental, and also a good choice to substitute for the invasive non-native burning bush that is still, kind of ubiquitous and available for planting, but it's a really bad invasive that gets out into natural areas and, takes over and outcompetes the native species. So anyway, many shrub species are going to provide beautiful fall foliage in addition to beautiful fruits in the summer and beautiful blooms in the spring. Speaking of those fruits, many shrubs produce fruits that persist on the plant from through the summer into the fall and sometimes even into the winter. And that's because they're not really tasty to the wildlife until they go through like a freeze thaw cycle, and or until all the other berry sources have been wiped out and devoured by the winter birds and there's nothing left to eat. So I'm thinking of things like winterberry holly. Some of the chokeberries have berries like that that are not really palatable until later into the winter. But again, from a landscape point of view, those berries are going to persist on the plant. And so they're going to, again, provide that beautiful visual interest. So the plant I have on my screen here is the common witch hazel shrub. And I should mention that most of the plants that I'm showing here are available for purchase through Garden for Wildlife. So not all of them are going to be native. You have to, obviously pick the ones that are native to where you are. And the site will tell you that when you put in your zip code. But the American or common witch hazel blooms in the very late fall. It's really, really neat. It's a plant, and it has these, beautiful, very almost spider leg like yellow flowers. So that can add a little bit of a pop of color in the late fall when almost nothing else is blooming. So again, shrubs are going to provide year-round visual interest and landscape interest if you add them to your garden or your landscape. All right, so now we're going to get into the real reason I'm here. Reason number 4 why you should add more shrubs is that they provide habitat for wildlife. I've already mentioned a bunch of examples over the course of the last few reasons, but let's unpack this for a minute. So I think if you're here tonight, you probably already know that one of the most important ways that we can support populations of our local wildlife species are, the kinds of species that are, can easily coexist right alongside us in our cities and towns and neighborhoods if we just give them habitat. So I'm not talking about, mountain lions and bears and moose. I'm talking about songbirds and hummingbirds and butterflies like the swallowtail you see here, all sorts of other insects, small mammals, right? The wildlife that we can really support and share the land with if we just give them a little bit of habitat. Well, the most important way you can provide that habitat is by planting native plants. Native plants are the foundation of the food web. And they're the plants that the wildlife have co-evolved with over millennia. So their life cycles are in sync with each other, and their nutrition values of the plants are kind of synced to the nutritional needs of the local native wildlife. They're really like two pieces of a puzzle. And that's really kind of the definition of an ecosystem. It's the living things in the landscape and or in the environment, and how they are all interacting and relying on each other and the non-living aspects of that environment. So shrubs are going to be a critical way that you're going to provide a food web for all of those different kinds of wildlife. Again, the birds, the butterflies, and the other backyard wildlife. So how do shrubs provide food for wildlife? Well, a great example is what you see right here. So we've got a swallowtail butterfly. I'm not sure which one of the dark swallowtails this is. I need to refer to my guides and remember, because there's black swallowtails and spicebush swallowtails and the dark form of the tiger swallowtail. And I can't remember exactly what this one is just by looking at it. But at any rate, it's a swallowtail, right? And it is nectaring on a button bush. One of my favorite plants. I actually have a couple of these from Garden for Wildlife that I planted in my backyard a few years ago in a spot that gets a little bit of extra water. This plant can thrive in wet soils. It can grow in normal garden soils as well. But it's got this crazy, funky, totally round bloom on it. It's very fragrant, and it's incredibly attractive to pollinators. So not just the butterflies, but also bees and pollinating beetles and things like that. So this is a great example of a shrub that is, again, can grow in wet soil. So it might kind of serve, you might, it might help you if you have that kind of scenario, although you don't need wet soils for it. Those blossoms that come out in the late spring and early summer are totally ornamental, very, very visually interesting. So it's already checking all of those other boxes that I just mentioned. Then it's going to provide nectar to the pollinators. So other ways that your native shrubs are going to provide food for wildlife. Well, I mentioned this already. When the pollinators come to the blooms on the shrubs and they go and they get their nectar, or in some cases, they're going to be feeding on the pollen of that flower, they're going to pollinate. They're going to move the pollen around the flower and to other plants, and they're going to fertilize that flower. And that's the process by which the plant can form seeds. And then many plants are packaging those seeds inside fruits and nuts and things like that, and berries. And those things are a whole other layer of food for the local wildlife. So, the birds, the fruit-eating birds, and the small mammals, even the big mammals sometimes, are going to be coming, including humans, by the way, and feeding on those fruits and nuts and berries that your native shrubs are going to provide. I do want to go back to the bloom, though, because I forgot to mention, it's not just the nectar. It is the pollen that is the food source for many different insect species in particular, specifically many of our native bee species. So real quick, there's about 20,000 species of bees on this planet. Here in the US, we've got, or North America, we've got around 4,000. So in any given state, you have at least a few hundred species of bees that are native there. Not the honeybee. The honeybee is native over in Europe. And here in the US, it's really a domesticated species. It's much more like a chicken or a cow than it is wildlife. And most of our native bee species are tied to the native plants that they evolved with. And there is anywhere from 20 to 40% of our native bees are oligolectic. And what that means is that they can only feed their babies the pollen from specific native plants. So just like butterflies and moths have specific native plants that are the only things that their caterpillars can eat, these oligolectic native bees, same thing. They can only, those species can only survive where there are the native blooming plants that they're tied to. And so there are many native shrubs that have these pollen specialists, these oligolectic bees that rely on them. Some willows and some elderberries, some of the viburnums also have native bees that are associated with them. So pollen, nectar, fruits, nuts, seeds, berries, these are all ways that your native shrubs are going to provide food for wildlife. And well, they're also going to support insects. And insects themselves are wildlife, but they are part of the food web. So the native shrubs are going to be, for example, caterpillar host plants that I was just mentioning, which is food. It's also the way that the caterpillars are reproducing. And so it counts as my fifth reason, which I'll get to in a second as well. But the plants themselves might get eaten. And as wildlife gardeners, we know that that's an okay thing. That kind of flies in the face of conventional gardening, but we know that, again, plants are the foundation of the food web. So if you want to see beautiful songbirds and butterflies and know that you're supporting our native pollinators, you know that it's okay that some of your plants might get eaten a little bit, and that's totally okay. So there's a wide range of ways that your native shrubs are going to be providing food for wildlife. So my fifth and final reason for why you should plant more shrubs is that in addition to providing habitat in the form of food sources, native shrubs are also going to provide the other components of habitat that wildlife need, namely cover and places to raise young. So cover really is just giving wildlife places where they can get out of the elements, where they can, get out of bad weather, whether it's extreme heat, cold, snow, rain, high winds, whatever, compared to a blank lawn, right? That doesn't provide any cover. So because of, well, really some of the reasons I've already talked about, the structure that shrubs provide and the fact that no matter where you are, you can add them to your landscape, if you do that, you know that your garden and your landscape is always going to be providing some form of cover for wildlife to get out of the elements. Cover is also about giving wildlife places to hide from their predators, so that they're not just easy pickings when the predatory animals are around, and also for predators to have hiding places, so they have a fighting chance to actually get a meal, and that the prey just doesn't see them walking down the middle of the lawn and all run away. So cover is a really important aspect of habitat, and shrubs are a great way to provide it. Particularly, again, if you don't have, like a huge yard where you can add a bunch of trees, right, and have sort of that vertical habitat, shrubs can really go a long way in providing cover. And then the other component of habitat that shrubs provide are places to raise young. So we've talked about the caterpillar host plants. We've talked about the oligolectic pollen specialist bees that rely on those native shrubs and other native plants as the food source specifically for their babies. Again, without those host plants, those kinds of insects can't complete their life cycle. Their babies will literally starve to death without those particular native plants. And again, there's lots of shrubs that fall into that category. Shrubs are also a place where many bird species, like this hummingbird, will build their nests. Not all birds build their nests way up high in trees. In fact, many of our most common backyard birds actually prefer to nest sort of a little bit further down, and they're often nesting in shrubs, like the northern cardinal that I had in my very first slide. That's a great example. Robins, the common robin, they generally are going to be nesting in shrubs, not way, way, way high up. And so, the shrubs are going to be a really great place for the birds to nest, and they're going to provide the host plants for the pollinators. So, and lots of other animals are going to find that cover and places where their babies can hide right within the shrubs. And again, I'm comparing this, a landscape that is just lawn and maybe just some herbaceous wildflowers, maybe a tree or two, to a landscape that has all of those elements, but also has a lot of shrubs, from little itty bitty ground cover shrubs all the way up to, big, almost tree sized shrubs. If you add those shrubs, you're really going to enhance not only the visual appeal of your landscape, but you're also going to vastly improve its wildlife habitat value. So those are my 5 reasons why you should plant more shrubs in your landscape. And of course, all of these are reasons that, these are aspects of shrubs that are going to help you if you want to have your yard or your garden space recognized by the National Wildlife Federation as a certified wildlife habitat. The shrubs are going to provide 3 of the 4 habitat components, which are food, cover, and places to raise young. The 4th one is a water source. So, put in a bird bath, and if you have the good native shrubs and other native plants, and you throw in a water source, and of course you're not spraying pesticides everywhere and that kind of thing, you're gardening sustainably, that's what's going to achieve certified wildlife habitat status for you. So I'm going to wrap it up there, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we'll come back to the live stream here, and hopefully you all have some questions for me. And this, by the way, is my shameless plug for my book, Attracting Birds, Butterflies, and Other Backyard Wildlife. It's a how-to book on how to garden naturally with native plants. It'll walk you right through all the steps on how to provide all the habitat, and all of the proceeds, a portion of the proceeds, I should say, every time you purchase it, go back to support the work of the National Wildlife Federation. So with that shameless plug out of the way, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Julie, I can't see the chat, the public chat, I don't believe. Oh, now I can see it.
It is popping. There are a lot of comments and questions, which is great. There are a couple that I'm going to pull that came through. There are a few in here from a user on Facebook called Vashnisanti7665, asking specifically about yew shrubs and when it's safe to trim them. They need to move them. They want to know if they can move the mature shrubs. I'm not sure how much you know about that specific one, but I think trimming shrubs and transplanting them are questions others might have too.
Yeah.
So what would you say about that?
All right. So what I will just lead by saying, I think my best advice for all of those questions is to talk to like a local, like a horticulture person, right? Whether they're at your local extension service or even your local garden center or landscaping service, because the answer is going to be very different depending on where you are, what the species of plant is. There are certain plants that you want to prune in the fall. There are others that you want to prune in the spring. There are plants that bloom on old growth versus new growth. And so it really is going to depend. And I would, again, strongly suggest that you seek out some local expertise that know the plants that are growing in your region and can give you that advice. Of course, you can also do some Googling. So as far as yews go, the yews that are mostly found in landscapes are they're not native species. I don't believe they're invasive anywhere, so they're probably they're not terrible to keep in the landscape. But I always recommend when you can replace them with the good natives because they do support more wildlife. So I'll be honest, I don't really know what the best horticultural practice is for transplanting yews and pruning them. I do know that yews are very toxic. And so they're a really cool plant because we've actually been able to develop some incredible, powerful medicines for humans based on the chemicals that those plants produce. And pretty much all parts of them are toxic, so don't eat it, with the exception of the fleshy part of the aril. So they produce these red, what look like berries, but it's really an aril, which is a botanical thing. It's a little bit different than a berry. The seeds inside of those are toxic, but the fruit isn't. So again, I'm not encouraging you to go out and eat it, but I do think it's kind of a cool plant for some of those reasons. So again, sorry I couldn't answer 100%, but I think you'll find the answer out there if you look locally.
I think I will avoid that entire plant. That actually, Stephen Lancaster on YouTube commented that Maryland just added a lot of non-natives to their tier 1 list today, which is great. That's news to me, and I want to go check out what the updated list is.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing a couple of people talking about deer eating their shrubs.
Yeah.
That's a problem with the flowers and everything too. Can you talk a little bit about deer eating the shrubs and deer resistant plants?
Yeah. So my best advice on that is to import some wolves into your neighborhood. Again, I wish I had a magic solution to deer. They're there, they feed on plants, and it's really tough. In my experience, there's very few, deer-proof plants. Like, in my experience, if the deer are hungry enough, they will try anything. And so the most foolproof way of dealing with deer is to put up an 8-foot fence, right? And not everybody can do that. That's not really practical. You can get into buying repellent sprays or even making your own. I don't love that because we don't know what the impact is, say, on the pollinators or the caterpillars that are also there trying to feed on the leaves, and you're spraying hot garlic and hot pepper on the leaves of your shrubs. So that's a better solution. It's, especially if you use sort of the non-toxic and natural, but everything we do has an impact. So I would kind of encourage you to just think about that. I would definitely steer clear of predator urine. I'm not going to go on a soapbox about this, but think about where they're getting that predator urine, right? No one is going out into the woods and politely asking a bobcat to pee into a bottle that you can then go buy. There are horrific, basically, animal caged farms where they extract this stuff. So don't do that. Don't buy that stuff. It's not sustainable. It's not humane. So what are you left with, right? If you can't put up a fence, spraying repellents isn't good. Urine of predators, which, by the way, I don't even think would work. I don't know that there's any studies that really show that the predator urine actually works, because guess what? Predators are urinating in the wild and deer are still eating the wild plants, right? So my best advice when it comes to deer is, again, consult with your local extension service, your local native plant society, your local nursery. They often will have sort of regional and local lists of different plant species that are, again, deer resistant. Of course, most of those plants are going to be non-native, unless you were specifically going to a native plant society for a list. But so definitely seek those out and try to pick the natives and try them out in your landscape. What I will say is my strategy is to design your landscape naturally. And by that, I mean, not necessarily like don't use pesticides or whatever, although that's part of it. I mean like your actual landscape design. So in other words, if you have a super neat and tidy and formal looking landscape and the deer come through and they, eat half the plant, you're going to really notice it. It's going to be an eyesore. It's going to be a problem aesthetically, right? If you have a little bit more of a free-flowing, naturalistic design and look to your landscape, the browsing activity of animals like deer, like rabbits, and trust me, I'm with all of you. Like, I don't, luckily, the deer don't show up in my yard, even though we have them in our neighborhood. I think it's because everybody has dogs in our backyards. But we have so many rabbits, Eastern cottontails, and they are little just mouths, little cute furry mouths that just devour so many plants. So again, what I find to be the most effective thing is plant naturally. And yes, some of your plants are going to get eaten, but if you have that, full landscape look, and it is mimicking sort of a natural woodland edge or a meadow or a prairie, you tend to not notice the browse activity as much. I mentioned having a dog, I mean, I don't recommend keeping your dog outside all the time, but just having your dog running around in your yard sometimes is a deterrent. You can try motion detector lights. You can try motion detector sprinklers for like targeted plants. You can get tree protectors for seedlings or saplings of trees and shrubs that will at least let the plant get to a big enough size so the deer can't totally devour them. You could cage them in like a chicken wire. That's not really aesthetically pleasing either. So yeah, unfortunately, there's no perfect solution that I can offer, but hopefully some of that is helpful. What's next?
I seem to have confused some viewers by talking about the tier 1 plant lists. What can you tell us about changes to these like non-native lists and the states updating what's native and non-native? Well, not what's native. I mean, they know what's native, but like what plants to look out for, and why those change, those lists over time.
So just a little bit of context for anybody listening or watching that doesn't know what any of this means. So I've talked a little bit about this already, but from an ecological point of view, right, we've got plants and animals that, again, evolved in any given region of the world or country or state or region, whatever, for millennia, right? And generally what that means is that there are those interrelations, again, those two pieces of the puzzle, the pollinator and the plant that it pollinates. The emergence of the insects at the right exact time that the birds need the insects to feed their babies, right? This is all kind of in sync, right? And so when it comes to our human landscapes, right, for a whole bunch of different reasons, we tend to cultivate plants from that we pick based on aesthetics, right? And that's sort of the history of horticulture, or sort of benefit to us humans, right? And so that benefit could be food, it could be ornamental, whatever, right? And so unfortunately, what that means is that in the human landscape in our cities, towns, and neighborhoods, we have removed huge swaths of the native flora that the wildlife rely on and planted these non-native ornamental plants that we pick because we like them, right? And so not only does that wipe out biodiversity, but some of those plants sometimes, just like animals too that are non-native, can become invasive. And what that means is that they escape cultivation and they get out into the natural areas, and they don't have the natural checks and balances, and they kind of outcompete the native diversity that used to be there, and sort of simplify and kind of degrade the ecosystems, right? So that's sort of native plants and non-native invasive plants 101. So the question becomes, well, if these plants are so terrible and they're really wrecking ecosystems, why can people still go out and buy them? And that's a complicated question too, because a lot of these plants are tried and true in the garden biz, and there's people that make their living off of growing these plants and selling these plants. So it's hard to just say like immediately stop, don't plant them or whatever. But over the last few decades that this native plant habitat movement has been growing here in the US, there is more of a push and more awareness about the dangers of some of these invasive non-native plant species, and how, in some cases, it really would be better if we just didn't sell them at all. And so, different states have different methodologies of, putting together lists like noxious plant lists or, invasive plant lists. And then from there are efforts where, there's state level legislation that might ban the sale of certain plants. So again, it really varies widely from state to state. What states are doing what. There's probably some states where there's no activity. And then there's other states that are really active and have, kind of robust programs in this space. So I would, again, just do some Googling. Again, check with your county or university extension, check with your local garden center, talk to your local native plant society. Those are great local, state level or even local sources for what's really going on, where you are. And they're great resources. If there's a plant that you see on one of those noxious weed lists or, top invasive plants, don't plant it. And if you can, remove it and replace it with a good native plant, preferably a shrub.
Okay, I see a question I really like that I would like to bring up, but I wanted to circle back to something you said earlier about shrubs and containers, because we sometimes get this question, and some of the shrubs that we sell are very big, could be considered trees in the right condition. And so how do you find, do you know the species off the top of your head that are container plantable, or which ones are the right size for something like that?
Yeah, I think you can grow anything in a container, but whether or not it's going to thrive, whether or not you've got the experience again, from a horticulture point of view. So I would say, the easiest answer is to stick with shrub species that don't get huge. So things like blueberries, I think, and again, any of those vaccinium type shrubs and huckleberries and things like that, they generally don't get huge. And I think you can plant them. I, in my own yard, have a swamp azalea, which is one of our native deciduous azaleas that I am growing successfully in a fairly large container. I bought it several years ago, and I'm sure people on this will relate to this. I was like, oh my gosh, I must have this plant. And so I bought it. And then I was like, I don't know where I'm going to put it in my yard. And then it was like, oh my gosh, I got to get it in the ground or in a bigger container than the nursery pot. And I just, I planted it in a bigger container that I had. And it's doing just fine. And so I think, I'm trying to think of some other good smaller examples. Well, I mentioned the bunchberry shrub. There's another great sort of a viney shrub called bearberry or kinnikinick. I don't think you guys are carrying that one, but you should. If it's very commonly cultivated, so it's native to a lot of the northern tier states. But it is truly a ground cover, and it gets a really big red berry. Things like that would grow well. Anything that's like really, really huge, I'm thinking of like an elderberry shrub or even like the witch hazels. Those that I was talking about, those can get pretty huge. But you can prune shrubs, so you can shape the shrub and keep it into a size that is appropriate for a container. The biggest things with containers is that it's a pretty harsh environment, so the roots are very restricted. So they're going to suck up nutrients very quickly, and they're going to absorb water very quickly in that confined space of the container. So if you have a shrub in a container, you're going to have to be very mindful of those things. So, you're probably going to have to water it a lot more than you ever would if it was actually planted in the ground. You probably are going to have to fertilize it. A lot of times I recommend don't even bother fertilizing your native plants, because oftentimes they don't need it. In some cases, it could kill them because they're used to sort of the native soils as they are. But in a container scenario, you might want to consider doing some feeding. And it could be sort of an organic fertilizer. A lot of times I make compost tea because I compost my food and yard scraps. A lot of times I'll go out and I'll buy earthworm castings. And I'll use those as fertilizer in my container. So I think it's less about like what specific species is going to grow well in a container, and more about making sure you know how to grow a plant in a container, and put it in the right spot with the right amount of light, make sure it has water, make sure it has nutrients and that kind of thing.
Okay, so maybe not for beginners. It sounds like it could be a little challenging. When you said the huckleberries, though, I have two, and they're like this tall. I planted them in the fall, so that might be a good one. That one, as far as I know, stays relatively small.
Yeah.
I want the berries. I'm growing my little edible garden. I have the elderberry now, the blueberries, the huckleberry, and I don't know what I'm going to add next, but I have plenty of space to add more.
Yeah, I love it. Well, I did see a question that just flew through here about, can you have a native plant garden with a food garden,
David,
right?
that is exactly the question I was going to ask
Yes.
next. That's the one that caught my eye because that's such a great question.
It's a fantastic question. And my answer is absolutely 100%. And in fact, you are going to have a better, more productive, produce garden if you plant native plants in your landscape as well. And the reason is because of pollinators. Well, not just pollinators, but pollinators are the reason why many of our food plants produce the food. Squash, eggplant, tomato, uh, peppers, these are all pollinated by insects, mostly bees, right? And so you want to attract those pollinating insects to your yard. And so if outside the confines of your vegetable bed, the rest of your landscape has pollinator attracting plants, well, guess what? You're going to have more likelihood that your plants are going to get the best pollination that they can, and therefore you're going to have the most productive garden. Many of our flowering and fruit producing and nut producing trees are also pollinated by insects, bees. So all the stone fruits, so cherries and plums and peaches and those kinds of plants and apples are all pollinated by insects as well. Even if they don't necessarily always need an insect, like tomatoes can kind of self-pollinate, they produce more fruit if they are actually getting pollinated by bees as well. So 100%, yes, please plant the natives in addition to the vegetable plants. The other reason beyond pollinators is that native plants are going to attract the beneficial uh, insects and other predators of any potential pests. So if you plant native plants, you're going to be attracting the natural populations of ladybugs and lacewings and predatory beetles and all the other great insects and invertebrates. You're going to be attracting spiders that are going to be building their webs and hiding in all that native vegetation, which are going to help you control and eliminate any of those pests. The songbirds, okay? Songbirds are predators. They are out there tirelessly hunting for insects to feed their babies in the spring and summer when you're growing your vegetables. And so, yeah, if you plant native plants, they're going to attract so many more songbirds and hummingbirds and woodpeckers and things like that that are going to help keep your pests down too. So 100%. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention one of the coolest ways that native plants are providing food for wildlife. And it's one I'm trying to remember or remind myself to talk about more. And it is something called extra floral nectaries. Okay, so we think of flower nectar or nectar as a sugary substance that plants produce inside of their flowers to attract their pollinators. And the pollinators get the sugar nectar as their food reward, and then they get dusted in pollen, and then they pollinate the plant, right? But some plants, including shrubs, and I know elderberry is one of them, produce nectar on the stems of the plants as well, not on the flower. And these are called extra floral, so beyond the flower, nectaries. And the reason they do it is that many beneficial predatory insects also like to get that little sugar water as an extra boost of nutrients. And so the plants produce them to attract those beneficial predatory insects to the plant, and they drink up that little bit of nectar. And then while they're at it, they gobble up all the aphids and all the scale insects and all of the other, pest invertebrates that might be existing on that plant. So it's pretty freaking cool. And so anyway, extra floral nectaries. But yeah, I thought that was a great question. So yeah, please do plant your natives alongside your vegetable and other food producing plants.
Awesome. I have not started the food garden yet, but that's on the to-do list. I started with all the natives. I haven't seen anyone in the chat ask this question, but I had it on our list of starter questions. Maybe not everyone knows about this, but for the berry producing shrubs, sometimes you need a male and a female in order to get the berries.
Yes.
And so we get a lot of questions about this as a retailer of plants because people are like, am I going to get berries? Am I getting a male and a female? And our growers don't always sex those plants. And so our recommendation is always buy multiple, buy 4 or more if you can to increase your odds. But can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and I'll say that that's not unique to Garden for Wildlife. It's, when you go into a retail nursery, they almost never have the plants sexed. So it is, and sometimes it's hard to tell. But yeah, basically, this is some botanical terms we'll share. So it is monoecious, means that the plant has male and female flowers on the same plant. So it can sort of self-fertilize. Dioecious means that the male and the female flowers are on separate plants. So mono means one, so it's one plant has both male and female. Dio means two, means you have separate male and female plants. So hollies are probably the best example that I can think of a dioecious plant. So you need the male and the female plant so that they can cross-pollinate. And so, yeah, the best recommendation is to just buy multiples. And, like I was saying before, shrubs are great in the landscape. And what I didn't say from a landscape design point of view is that shrubs do really well when you plant them in clusters. You really increase and maximize the habitat value when you don't just have one shrub plunked in the middle of your lawn, but when you have like a living shrub row, along the border of your property. It kind of acts as like a living fence, and you can plant multiple shrub species. You can plant things that bloom in the spring, and then other things that have berries in the summer or blooms in the summer. Some things that have good fall color, right? And in that one landscape feature of this living shrub row fence, you can have tons of visual interest, tons of habitat value. And so, the idea of buying multiple shrubs is actually a really good one, regardless of whether they're monoecious or dioecious. But yeah, it's a great question. And it's something that you should look at the plant tag or the plant info on the website when you're buying it, because it's typically noted for plants that are dioecious that you really do need to have the male and the female. And that will tell you, okay, well, then maybe instead of just buying one, I'm going to buy three. And, it's a little bit of a gamble. You might not necessarily, get it. But the other thing is to remember that because these plants are native to where you're living, their wild counterparts are out there in the landscape too. So, if you're lucky, you'll have within a reasonable distance some wild, versions of the native plants that, you're planting out there, and that pollination will happen just on its own course. So.
Yeah, and if we get all of our neighbors planting native, then we'll just have little
Correct.
wildlife corridors everywhere,
Exactly.
and we won't have to worry about these things.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay, we have a couple of messages in here. Martha thought the info on the elderberries was pretty cool. I'm actually excited to see that play out as well when mine starts, when everything comes back to life in the spring. Because that one was a new addition this past fall for me. Martha also noted that when she got her winterberry plants, they had berries and they haven't produced them since. I'm not sure what the time frame is there, but I do wonder if maybe they had the berries at the garden center or nursery, and then you didn't have all the plants you needed when you planted them. And do you think that's
there could be any number of reasons why you're not seeing berries on the elderberry. So it could be
the winterberry.
I'm sorry, winterberry is what I meant. It could be that, again, you don't have, like, maybe you have all male plants and no female plants, or, vice versa. So that could be it. It could be, if the plants are not planted in their ideal conditions, a lot of times plants, if they're struggling, they're not gonna bloom, and they're not gonna produce fruits. And so I have to share that I am facing that right now, because I also have some winterberry shrubs that I think in my yard, I'm just not getting enough light where they are. And so, they can tolerate a little bit of shade, but I think I have too much. And the button bush is there too. And the button bush, after a couple of years, is finally producing some blooms, but I have yet to get any berries on my elderberries. Now, again, I might have two males. I don't know, but so there's a couple of factors that might be at play there. The plants might not just be old enough too. So they might have to get established a little bit more before they're really going to bloom and set fruit. So there's also potentially maybe the soil is not giving them the nutrients that they need to thrive. And again, they're struggling plants. They struggle to do what you want them to do, bloom and fruit. So it could be any number of reasons. Again, I've said it 10 times already on this live stream. I really do encourage folks to tap into your local expertise. And, you might even have somebody that, a landscape or somebody with like plant knowledge. A lot of landscapers are, they mow lawns and they're not going to have deep horticultural knowledge on things like when is the right time to prune. So, but ask around, and you might even have expertise right within your community. Where I live, we've got a really active gardening community and some really super knowledgeable folks that even when I have a question, because I'm not a horticulturalist, right? I'm a naturalist. I know about the wildlife connections and whatever. But if I have a question, I'm like, wait, when is the right time to prune? Even if it's a native plant, I can just shoot a Facebook message or even a text if I have their number to some local folks and get those answers too. So don't overlook that.
I did see a master gardener in the chat, and I know that is a small group of people, but they are everywhere and they're super knowledgeable. So tapping into your local native plant societies or finding your local group of master gardeners can be a really great resource of knowledge. You said something about shade, and I remember seeing a comment earlier about like what shrubs do well in shade.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And I think a lot of people are maybe wondering that we see a lot of interest in plants in general that are for shade. So what would you say to which ones do best in shade?
Yeah. So again, it's going to vary region to region. So the ones that I'm most familiar with are going to be sort of eastern woodland type plants. But if you're in the Pacific Northwest or if you're in the deep South, there might be different ones. But the viburnums, some of our native viburnums, like arrowwood viburnum, which Garden for Wildlife carries, they grow in deep woods. So that's a really, really great one. Some of the huckleberries are woodland plants. Spice bush. Spice bush is another one that naturally grows in the woods. And so that's a great one that can tolerate pretty decent amounts of shade. So trying to think of some other good ones in other regions that I might be able to recommend. Things like Mahonia and Oregon grape, if anybody again is in the Pacific Northwest. Invasive here in the East because they're not native here, but in the Pacific Northwest, they're very common native plants. Rhododendrons, our native rhododendrons and our native azaleas, many of them are shade, woodland type plants. So again, what you want to do is look for woodland plants. And Clethra alnifolia, summer sweet, which is one that Garden for Wildlife carries, another great woodland plant that grows in forests. So and by the way, many of these will also be just fine in sunnier conditions. They'll grow faster. They might bloom more prolifically, fruit more prolifically. But if you look at their actual ecological habitat, a lot of it is in woods where it's very shady. So.
Thank you. We are coming up on about an hour, and I don't want to keep you here forever. But this has been a lot of great information. I did share a link to your book in the chat because a couple of people asked for that.
Oh, so
your shameless plug worked.
Thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoy it.
I've also shared some links to the National Wildlife Federation's Native Plant Finder. So that is the big database of search by zip code to find native plants for your region. And then Garden for Wildlife website, you can search by zip code on our site as well, and you'll be able to buy the plants that we currently have in stock. We have a growing offering of native shrubs. We have over 30 species now of native shrubs for all across the country and a selection of native trees. So definitely go see what we have available, including the viburnums. That's one of the most popular ones. And the spice bush, that one always sells out when we bring it online. It's extremely popular. But did you want to add anything before we hop off, David?
No, just I love that so many people showed up tonight and how active the chat is. I'm like scrolling through it now, looking, and I want to answer all the questions. But I think I would just like to thank everybody for their interest in gardening naturally. It's one of the most powerful things we can do as a personal action to kind of help restore some of the damage that we human beings have inflicted on this planet, right? And, is planting a wildlife habitat garden going to save the world? No. But if I do it and you do it and your neighbors do it, like Julie was saying before, it really does add up. And it really does help many of our declining species. Our songbirds are declining, our butterflies, our bees, they're all disappearing very rapidly. And these native plants are key to helping them, stay stable and maybe even recover. And it's even not just about the declining wildlife. Planting native is about keeping our common species common, because if they don't have the habitat, they're going to start disappearing too. So it really is a powerfully positive thing we can all do. And I want to thank everybody for caring enough to come tonight to learn a little bit more about natives, and keep doing it. And gardening's a journey too. Don't feel like you have to be an expert. Just plant some natives this spring and learn, observe, and grow. And then, every year you'll learn a little bit more and you'll add more natives, and pretty soon you'll have an incredible garden and you'll be the expert. So yeah, I just want to say thanks to everybody.
Well, thank you, David. And we're getting a lot of love from the chat, which is really great to see. And I'm sure that we will host another live stream sometime later this year on another topic, because these have been really great conversations, really engaging chats. So thank you all for joining. Thank you, David. We'll be back for another conversation.